I'm Sapna Shah, Managing Director at the Global Impact Investing Network, also known as the GIIN. We are so pleased to welcome you to Next Normal Now, our signature series of virtual events for 2021, designed to discuss systemic change unfolding in the here and the now. Today's event is the first in a three-part series. Today's topic is focused on one of the most pressing issues of our time, which is inclusive economic growth. And throughout today's agenda, you'll be hearing about this push for inclusion from the people driving it. This is a truly global event, and I can already tell by the introductions in the chat, with change makers from 6 continents in attendance. And even in this virtual setting, I hope that we can all interact with one another. So with that, I'm going to share some technical instructions and a request, even though I know that at this point in 2021, we've all become unwilling experts in remote technology. At the bottom of your screen, you see a chat function. If you scroll on that and select everyone, your chat will be visible to everyone. I'm hoping that you can please introduce yourself, name, organization, and the country that you're joining from today. I can already see so many folks have done this, and it's pretty exciting to see how many people and how many different places we have among us today. This chat is also where you can make general comments throughout today's event. It's also a fantastic place to share resources, such as a mission-aligned organization's website, your own LinkedIn profile, or other research or resources you might want to share with everyone. We strongly encourage you to interact with us and each other this way. We want today's technical experience for you to be smooth, of course. So if you experience any issues or need any support at all, please don't hesitate to chat with our technical lead, my colleague Arjun Reddy. His name's also available from the drop-down menu, and he has the word host written next to his name. Just chat him if you need anything during this time together. Arjun, would you mind introducing yourself to the group? The last bit of housekeeping I'd like to share with all of you before we get started with our exciting event is today's agenda. Arjun is pasting the agenda into the chat right now. As you'll see, we'll be moving from speeches to fireside chats to exciting stories. And so if you have any trouble and get lost, you can also find the full agenda on the Next Normal Now website. This is such an exciting day for us here at the GIIN. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, the GIIN is the global champion of impact investing, an industry that invests to generate positive and measurable social and environmental benefit alongside a financial return. Our worldwide network is made up of more than 35,000 individuals and over 350 member organizations from around the world. And the impact investing industry is growing quickly. Each year, impact investors are allocating more capital to entrepreneurs and to other investors who are solving the world's most pressing challenges, or seeking to, such as the climate crisis and our growing inequality. But we all know that the problems we're trying to solve are growing far more quickly. At the GIIN, we envision a world where financial markets serve all members of society, and where finance plays a role in solving those big global challenges. We also believe that impact investing is just one solution along many different examples on the path to that reality. But for that future to become a widespread reality, what we need right now is systemic change and fundamental change. That's why today is so exciting, because today's event is all about the change that we are trying to make to have a truly inclusive economic growth and financial system. We see this at the GIIN as one of the defining challenges of our time, and we've heard as much from many of you in our conversations. And today we'll be hearing about practical solutions and replicable innovations towards the drive for inclusion to drive real progress. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsors, leading companies who are innovating the way to our next normal right now. They are Chemonics, Jonathan Rose Companies, KPMG, Responsibility, Treehouse Investments, and Wellington Management. I'll also take a minute to thank Impact Alpha, who is our media and marketing partner for the Next Normal Now series. So with all of that in mind, let's get started. I'm here to introduce the first fireside chat of this event and the first in our Next Normal Now event. Here are the co-founder and CEO of the Global Impact Investing Network, my colleague Amit Bori, having a conversation with Darren Walker, the president of the $14 billion international social justice philanthropy, the Ford Foundation. Darren and Amit, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Sapna. I'm so excited about this conversation because I know that Darren's vision for a more inclusive future will inspire our audience, but also because Darren and the GIIN have such a special past together. Years ago, when Darren still worked at the Rockefeller Foundation, he helped provide the seed funding that launched the Global Impact Investing Network when I was the only employee. That not only changed the landscape for impact investing, but it changed my career and my life. Over the past 11 years, the GIIN's path has evolved alongside Darren's path. Today, he's a global leader in pushing for a more inclusive system, which is a primary focus across the impact investing industry as well. Darren, welcome to Next Normal Now.
Thank you, Amit. And it is really gratifying to see what has happened with this kernel of an idea of GIIN. I remember that memo when this was just an idea, and the smart strategic decision to have you be its leader, the combination of that and Anthony Bug-Levine and so many others who have worked over the years, it's incredibly gratifying to me as a grant maker and as an investor in bold ideas to see the GIIN, which is absolutely a bold idea, manifest a dozen years later with such global impact. So congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And of course, we wouldn't be here without you. And so thank you for your support back then and your continued support of our work and of our network and the entire community that we support all around the world. And for many people around the world, and perhaps even for some in our audience, this idea of inclusion and the idea of growth and capitalism sometimes seem fundamentally at odds. Of course, we believe this is a misperception, and you've spoken about avoiding false binaries and trade-offs and avoiding zero-sum thinking. How can we rewire that thinking, and how do we combat that?
I think we know from the data now that actually inclusion grows the pie. We have always thought of the systems of capitalism and the economics of capitalism as a zero-sum framework. And I actually think that we know that by investing in inclusion, meaning investing in human capital, broadly speaking, investing in building assets and developing entrepreneurs that are diverse, that actually broadens and increases the capital flow. I'm a believer in capitalism, Amit, but if I am to be candid, as an American, we've never really given capitalism a chance in America because the kind of economy we have had has traditionally excluded far too many people. You can't have a capitalist system in the 19th century as we did and not pay for labor. You can't have a capitalist system in the 20th century and redline entire parts of the country where African Americans and lower income people live and not let capital flow into those communities, to pass government policy restricting capital from flowing into those communities. So what I'm calling for is actually to let capitalism in a more inclusive way married with policy that promote inclusion that will deliver a more shared prosperity.
That absolutely resonates with me. And I think it's so top of mind for me at this moment, a year into the pandemic, when we see the stock market at record highs. And yet for far, far too many, we know that suffering has never been more immense or intense. How do we get a fundamental sense of interconnectedness and interdependence, when the world of the haves and the have-nots have never seemed further apart?
This is a profound challenge, particularly for countries like the United States and other advanced economies where democracy and capitalism intersect. Because in the United States, I will say, and for many parts of the world, what happened last year was horrific. The pain, the suffering, the trauma visited upon millions of people, while some of us enjoyed enormous financial benefit and return. Now, why is that? It is because in part of public policy that encouraged through the kind of asset valuation. And so if you're lucky like me to own real estate, to have a portfolio invested in the markets, this has been a boom time from the standpoint of economics. But we have had a failure of policy because at the same time, we have not addressed the issue of distribution, which we capitalists don't like to talk about, but is increasingly urgent, because we cannot have a system that delivers for a few the broad benefits of a system and not include so many others. I think this is what I mean when I say we must have inclusive capitalism, capitalism that actually works for more people.
Absolutely. And I want to actually start to paint a picture of what that would look like if we're successful. If we fast forward now to the next normal, and really start to articulate what that looks like and paint the picture of this future for us. If we got this right, we actually built inclusion into our capitalist system, what would our next normal look like? What would be different? What would it feel like for the people living in it? What would the human impact be?
Well, let's start at the top. And what I mean by that is we have a system that is designed by and has benefited mostly white men. Now, this is not a criticism of white men or a critique of white men. It's to simply say that we have a system that has been designed by and benefits over indexes for that population. So what will look different is if there are more diverse people leading entrepreneurial enterprises, leading public and private companies, populating the C-suites, the boards. So at the top of these organizations, it will look different. Inclusion will manifest in ways that make the composition of these structures, these forums, look different, which we know in turn will make them more successful because we know the data around diversity and what it does to performance. So this is not about doing a favor to Black and brown people and women. This is about ultimately EPS. This is about fundamental business sense. Then it would also look like, in terms of who benefits, it would look different because we would ensure that the pipeline, the aperture for opportunity broadened to ensure that we had more people engaged in, more people participating in, more people working their way up through the various systems and structures and succeeding. And so that's what inclusion would look like. And we would be investing in more places that we have historically not invested in.
Yeah, and my hope is that at this time, of massive dislocation, obviously an incredible amount of damage being done to so many communities, that have been set back years and decades in terms of this progress, that there's at least a greater awareness and focus on the need to build more inclusion into our system. In many ways, we've seen kind of an X-ray or a spotlight put on the inequities that exist in our system as is today. And so I'm hopeful that this is a time and of us to make leaps ahead as opposed to just incremental progress. How do we seize this moment to generate a more inclusive race to the top? And what can we do to make this future more concrete?
Well, I think what we can do to make this future more concrete is to scale the things that work. We know what works. There's enough evidence to demonstrate what inclusion looks like, and what the mechanisms for inclusion are, both policy, public policy, and private policy. So let's take mechanisms like the GIIN and blow them up to really invest in institutions like this that in turn can help mobilize more capital. Because the larger the GIIN gets in terms of its membership, in terms of the evangelizing you do around inclusion, the more people who buy into that, the more capital will flow towards inclusive investments and to more populations participating in the benefit. And so we need investment in the institutions, the ideas, and the people who are leading these efforts. And so we need both public investment and we need private investment, and we need the mechanisms that bring public and private together, like the GIIN, to be strengthened and resilient.
No, thank you for that. And I think this is in a time where we need to be really ambitious and bold, because I do think there's a window of opportunity that is certainly something unlike anything I've seen in my professional career. One of the things that is certainly interesting now is that we are seeing baseline expectations for corporate behavior and citizenship rising. So we're setting kind of higher floors for what it means to be a good company and what it means to be a good investor. In the impact investing world, we see ourselves as not just setting a floor, but also trying to break through ceilings. Driving a race to the top of thinking about how capital can be deployed in a way that serves multiple objectives, not just seeking financial returns, which are of course important and essential to most investors, but also as driving greater impact for people on the planet. Where do you see impact investing fitting on this path forward?
Well, I think impact investing is among the most important paths to get us to inclusion. It allows us to see that investing can and should have both a social and a financial return. It demonstrates a mechanism by which our idea of stakeholder capitalism can actually manifest, right? So it demonstrates that you can invest in initiatives like affordable housing or green energy or financial services for the poor, and demonstrate that these are viable, predictable income streams and revenue, and also predictable social objectives associated with those investments. And so I think the impact investing world, the future is bright. ESG is no longer a sideshow at most corporations. I'm on 3 public company boards, and I can assure you ESG used to be in some places a kind of a backwater area in the company. That is no longer the case. There is no public company or even private companies who take themselves seriously or want to have any credibility with investors. I'm not talking about credibility with activists and NGOs. Credibility with investors if you don't take ESG seriously. And that connection, I think, is really important. So I'm actually very bullish and very hopeful that we are at a place where we can have a race for the towards the top, and I think whether we get there or not will be a function of just how far organizations like the GIIN get, and how courageous leaders are willing to be to really step up and demonstrate the efficacy of this idea, and how within their own company using impact investing can be a tool for both investment and social outcomes.
Mhm. Well, we're seeing the same thing in our network as well. The course of before 2020, we saw a kind of growing interest in impact investing on 6 continents, all around the world. And back when we used to travel, I was traveling all around the world to engage with leaders in places like Brazil and Tokyo and Amsterdam and India and Kenya and beyond, who are all thinking about how they can use capital to have a greater impact on the world. Over the course of 2020, we also saw more institutional investors, family offices, asset managers, and others starting to think about how they could have a greater impact, or how they could drive positive contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals or to the Paris climate targets. And I hope that we can build on that momentum and really propel us towards a next normal that is more inclusive and has that built into the system. Not just something that's thought about on the side, but that is central to the way we think about what we're trying to grow is an inclusive system. And those are kind of integrated fully. Now, we started this conversation with you as an individual and your leadership and helping to get the GIIN off the ground. And one thing that's I've always admired is your personal life story. In many ways, there are things that resonate with me. I was raised by a single mom. We spent much of my childhood on public assistance, or what we call welfare, in the United States. And I've been able to have a tremendous opportunities in my personal life, in my education, and of course, have a great career with a great deal of purpose. Can you talk a little bit about how your personal life story animates your work going forward, and how does it keep your work vibrant?
Well, I think my personal story is one of just remarkable luck, and having champions to support me. And clearly, like you, when you grow up in a low-income household with a single mother, that makes you resilient, and in my case, very ambitious to make a difference in the world and make a difference in my own circumstance. So I was very lucky because I was in the first class of Head Start in 1965, a program in the United States as part of the 1960s President Johnson's war on poverty. And that program really propelled me towards a terrific education, all in public schools. Ahmed, I like to say that I am the graduate of exclusively public schools. And I say that because certainly when I was growing up in America, my belief was that my country was cheering me on, that actually America, in spite of the problems in the history of this country of racism, the problem of my own status as a low-income kid, I still felt like my country wanted me to succeed. And so I was very lucky, and that was demonstrable that my country wanted me to succeed, because whether it was good public schools or a scholarship and a Pell Grant to a great public university and law school, and leaving without a concern about debt or the kinds of things young people are faced with today, I always felt like I would be able to get on the mobility escalator and ride it as far as my talents would take me and my ambition would take me. And I was very lucky to spend a decade at a law firm and then at UBS, and had a great run on Wall Street. And I really appreciated that opportunity. But for me, I needed a purpose more than just working towards my P&L and bonus time every year, right? I really wanted to work in a community like Harlem. And so I was very lucky to get to work at the Abyssinian Development Corporation and learn so much about community development, economic development in a really challenging community at a time of tremendous transformation. And of course, it's hard when you are in Harlem today to believe that 30 years ago, when I worked in Harlem, there were times when it was hard to sell a very nice brownstone for $250,000. And so it was a different time. And I feel incredibly lucky. That experience and my own life experience as a kid growing up really has shaped how I operate today and what informs my priorities and my approach at the Ford Foundation. That is really about thinking about what it feels like to be excluded, to be left out and left behind, as so many people feel in our country and in many countries around the world.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I, can't say how much I appreciate your perspective on this, on your own personal story and kind of how you bring that to your work. And of course, your perspective on this more inclusive next normal that we're building toward. Because of this pandemic, we're clearly at a historic inflection point. And I hope it's clear to everyone that we cannot return to the old ways, but we must reimagine a different future. Your vision and the way you express it and how inclusive it is helping all of us do exactly that. So Darren, thank you so much for everything you've done for me and for the GIIN, and thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ahmed, and congratulations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Darren and Amit. It's incredibly inspiring to hear Darren's personal story. And I think many of the comments raised in the discussion by both Darren and Amit certainly resonate with me. I think one thing that Darren mentioned that I think is powerful is that inclusion actually grows the pie. I think this is one of the things he started by saying, and that without inclusion, we actually don't really have capitalism, because it just fundamentally isn't capitalism when finance is prevented from flowing to certain pockets of society. And I think that's powerful because it reframes a lot of the arguments that you hear about letting capitalism do its job and everyone will be taken care of. And I think certainly Darren's message is powerful, that that's actually not true and also not what's happening right now. So that's what one of the things I found powerful from the event just now, the chat. I'd love to hear what some of you took away and were reflecting on as that was going. And so if you want to so engage, please pop your reflections into the chat. We'd love to see what they are. And just a quick reminder, when you do chat, please do select everyone from the drop-down menu and not just all panelists, because while we're thrilled to read what you have to say, I'm sure your intention is to share it with everyone. Darren also spoke a bit about the need for replicable and scalable business models that prove that inclusion does generate revenue and return. And I think that that's a perfect segue to our breakout sessions, which are coming up next. In these next breakout sessions, of which we have 5, we will hear how these big and bold inclusion goals actually translate into practice and tactics. And we'll hear straight from practitioners and investors, colleagues among us, who are driving this push for inclusion right now. So as you can see from the agenda, we have 5 breakout sessions coming up, and I will read these titles to you so that we can keep them straight. But number 1 is investing in a more diverse and inclusive economy. 2, inclusive investment models. 3, unlocking institutional capital. 4, financing a green transition. And 5, introduction to impact investing. Now, if you're like me, and a lot of that sounds compelling, I will say you do not have to pick just one. We invite you actually to move back and forth if you so choose to do so. You can listen to one conversation and then listen to a piece of another, because there is something for everyone in this lineup. I do want the breakout room experience to be seamless for all of you and for all of us, so just please listen closely for some technical directions. Today's event is on 2 different Zoom platforms. Right now, we're together in a Zoom webinar space, but the breakout rooms are in Zoom meetings, and that'll open a new window on your computer. You can find the Zoom meeting links to the sessions either in the agenda or pasted into the chat box right now. There's a different link for each breakout session. So just click the link for the session that you'd like to join. The breakout sessions will last 50 minutes, and then we will meet back here in the webinar. When the breakout sessions end, we'll all return together here, and you can do so by using the registration link that is in your registration confirmation email. So again, to come back here at the end of 50 minutes, please use the link provided in your registration confirmation email. So please keep that email handy and that link handy so you can return to the full group. So I hope you enjoy the breakout sessions, and I will see you back here in 50 minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I do hope that you enjoyed the breakout sessions. I myself was able to float through two of them, the inclusive investment models and the transition to green financing, and both were really practical, really tangible, and pretty inspiring. So I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did. We have people still joining and returning and making their way back from the breakout sessions, but we can go ahead and move along. I'm pleased to say, as you may have noticed from the agenda, there's still much more to come, including an incredible second fireside chat with a visionary in the field of inclusive economic growth. And she'll be offering a perspective that we don't get to hear very often, so stay tuned for that. And we'll have that followed by a final storytelling panel, which will explore firsthand accounts of people working for inclusion in the financial inclusion space, and quite inspiring as well. So stay tuned for that. But before we move along to there, I'd like to welcome back to this virtual stage, computer screen, my colleague, co-founder and CEO of the GIIN, Amit Bori. So Amit, welcome. And here again is Amit Bori.
Great. Thank you so much, Sapna. I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you. And as Sapna said, I hope you enjoyed your conversations, and I hope you learned something new and that you were even challenged in your thinking. If you've attended other GIIN events, you'll notice that this one is especially focused on practical solutions and replicable innovations. I certainly heard those themes as I dipped in and out of many of the breakout room conversations. And I want to just take a moment to highlight some of the things that I heard. I'm absolutely sure I'm just scratching the surface of these great conversations. They're incredibly rich, but my hope is to give you a bit of a perspective on some of the conversations you may have missed, depending on which breakout room you're in. So I'll take them one at a time. So first, when it comes to investing in a more diverse and inclusive economy, I think this is such an important topic that's on the top of so many minds right now all around the world. And I want to highlight some of the comments from the panelists who were participating. So Monica from Kona certainly spoke to the importance that if we're going to get to inclusion, from her view, we need to move away from blaming and shaming and really get curious about why has the system been so lopsided. And it's also important in a global context that race and ethnicity mean very different things in different places. So it's important to be attentive to regional context, of course, and even regional language nuances. Rashni from Leapfrog spoke about how exclusion is multifaceted. So it's important for us to think about how inclusion must also be multifaceted. And from her perspective, it's important to really focus on the end consumer as a guiding star. So try to give end consumers an opportunity to talk about their wants, needs, and aspirations. And she also offered some advice to really work on understanding who you were speaking to, not only to customers, but also from the broader community. And last but not least from that session, we were thrilled to hear from Crystal at OISTA, and her focus and their focus is on Native American communities. And to get to inclusion, there's an overarching focus on addressing invisibility. And she really spoke to the important issue that most Native communities still don't have a seat at the table. So when we're thinking about inclusion, how important it is to bring voice and space to so many communities that don't historically have representation. I'll move next to talk about inclusive investment models. Priya from Impact Engine said something that I think is we're hearing more and more about all around the world, which is how to share more prosperity with employees and workers. She spoke about their work in employee ownership models to help build wealth among workers, and how they've been focusing on an ESOP strategy at a company which is converted to 100% employee ownership. We heard the way that technology can play a role in transparency and disclosure from Tracy at the Annie Casey Foundation, who spoke about a fund manager that developed a customized tech tool that allowed them to interface directly with portfolio companies' HR systems. So that way they could look at key employee metrics and demographic data, including the diversity of the labor force. And we also heard from Manoj from Arohan talking from the perspective of financial inclusion, and particularly about how a small company with relatively modest funds was really transformed into being a major MFI in India that had a reach that affected 2.3 million women by helping them to manage their own micro enterprises. Now, I was able to also join the Unlocking Institutional Capital session, which I think is so important as we think about global capital markets. How do we connect these models on the ground to some of the larger pools of capital that we need to tap into to drive a truly inclusive economy? We heard from Carlin at MN Services, whose work is in large part investing on behalf of workers through their pension clients. They do a lot of work on climate change and are very active in helping to address climate sustainability through their investments. But she spoke about an increasing focus on the S in ESG, the social issues. And they've been doing work on Living Wage Financials Initiative to improve standards and human rights for workers in the global supply chain of the companies they invest in. And they do this with a conviction that sustainable returns or sustainable kind of inclusion and equality and rights will drive better returns in the long term. From a very different perspective, we heard from Lasita from Guaranco, who's working to bring bonds to projects in Africa and South Asia and actually help list them on the London Stock Exchange. And this is to address the misperceptions of risk and the issues of capital access around investing in emerging markets. They've started with bonds from Kenya, Ghana, India, the Philippines, and others, and they're working to expand that, particularly as we see more activity as the COVID crisis, as we make progress addressing the COVID crisis. And lastly, from that panel, we heard from Sebastian of Symbiotics, who's also working to create liquidity for emerging market bonds through an exchange platform. They've already issued over 200 bonds, including a recent green bond from Sri Lanka. So one of the big themes from Unlocking Institutional Capital is not only the focus on inclusion, but helping to bridge the gap between the global North and global South and create access to capital for many markets where liquidity is a huge issue, which constrains investments and constrains the capital available to entrepreneurs. So I want to move to talking about financing a green transition. And we had a number of great perspectives represented on this critical issue. I'm particularly, interested in the intersection of how we think about the green transition, where we know that it's kind of top of the agenda for so many governments, investors, and companies. But it'll be absolutely critical that we make sure that that green transition is an inclusive transition, one that creates opportunity for everyone. Stefan from Fondaction talked about huge opportunities to invest in the green transition. and the conviction that we need to do impact investment because it is absolutely necessary for the planet. He also felt that it was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And if you think about the challenges that are posed by non-sustainability, it just compels us to think about how we can invest in a more sustainable future over the next 2 decades. From a very different perspective, we heard from Grace Hui from the Hong Kong exchanges, who is really speaking about the importance of companies taking on a net zero approach and setting explicit targets. She sees that disclosure will be very important and eventually will be mandatory, but it's important for investors to play a leadership role right now in demanding that disclosure in data and transparency. And to close out that panel, we heard Saskia from the GIIN Foundation really speak to the opportunities for growth and scaling innovative enterprises, but the challenges of how to make sure mission alignment and inclusion stay there while the enterprises are scaling. And to close out the breakouts, I do just want to speak to the importance of the Introduction to Impact Investing session. One of the things that GIIN's always committed to is bringing in new voices, new perspectives, new investors to this community. And I just want to acknowledge my colleagues, Sophia Sunderji and Leticia Emmy, for helping to create on-ramps for all those new to impact investing around the world. And I hope everyone in our network also sees their role in helping to expand this market and share our learnings. I really want to thank all of you for these important discussions and for your willingness to share your experience. We are a network for a reason, and that is because we believe there's an incredible opportunity for people all around the world to connect, so ideas and learnings can flow, and of course also so capital and opportunities can flow across borders and between institutions. Of course, we cannot gather in person, but we hope to help foster these discussions through the Next Normal Now platform to help connect all of us during this important time when so much great work is being done around the world. Now, I'd like to switch gears and channel today's thinking into a vision for where our world can go next. Fundamentally, what we want is a market and society that works for all people. And if you're attending this event, you don't need me to tell you that our current economic system does not work for everyone, and some people doubt that it ever will. The past year has made inequality even more pronounced. The coronavirus pandemic has challenged the global community in unprecedented ways. And unfortunately, more than a year later, it is still not close to ending in many parts of the world. The COVID health crisis has prompted a broader economic and social crisis that exposed some of our most troubling systemic frailties. The very engine of capitalism, its workers, seemed to get the short end of the stick again. Millions were laid off the moment the crisis struck. The most essential workers of the crisis, like caregivers and people working in our supply chains, labor under difficult circumstances and survive oftentimes at the lowest end of the pay scale. And if compensation reflects value, then our system clearly does not value these workers enough. And meanwhile, the stock market has reached record highs during this year of crisis. The basic disconnect is glaring. Now, as we work to end the pandemic, new questions of inclusion are arising. Plans for vaccine distribution have had setbacks almost everywhere, but it is already clear that residents of the world's wealthier countries are likely to have access to vaccines long before residents of poor countries. And without that access, UN leaders say COVID will continue widening global inequality. Of course, the pandemic is not happening in a vacuum. Across the United States, Europe, and beyond, last year brought widespread civil unrest and racial justice demonstrations that continue. Insufficient progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals is prompting real and reasonable doubt about whether the goals can be achieved by their 2030 target. And at the same time, the climate emergency is threatening lives in other ways. Despite entering the Paris Climate Accord, the United States is still not on track to meet the Accord's commitments, and neither is any other major developed economy. Meanwhile, an epidemic of misinformation and widespread mistrust is hitting important institutions around the world, from businesses to government, and public confidence in those institutions is greatly diminished. These are global, intersectional, systemic problems. To address them, we need global systemic change. If this year of upheaval has had any silver lining, it is this. Crisis has opened our eyes to this unprecedented opportunity for lasting change. One of the most powerful quotes from the year came from author and political activist Arundhati Roy. She described the pandemic and all that came with it as, quote, a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. It offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we've built for ourselves, she says. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Roy is absolutely correct. We do need a next normal, and we can achieve the future we're talking about here today. But to do it, both mindsets and actions must shift. We must come to see inclusion as essential and foundational to growth. We must decide inclusivity into our next economic system. The old normal says growth comes first, and only once we're growing do we ask, how can we be more inclusive? The next normal will recognize that inclusion never takes root as an optional after-the-fact add-on. The next normal will demonstrate that inclusivity is the foundation upon which most widespread economic growth can occur. Impact investors will need to be thinking and asking about inclusion at multiple levels. It's not simply who's in leadership or is the board diverse. It must also be who are the owners, who is employed, who is served by these products and services, who shares in the prosperity. But if we are truly building toward a market and a society that includes all people, the change must be even broader. Our ways of understanding economic growth must evolve. We must be asking the fundamental question, what exactly are we trying to grow? The old normal simply tells us to look at a nation's GDP or the stock index. But the next normal will not be tracking that growth only in dollars, yen, euros, or real. The next normal will be thinking of equity, of social progress, of quality of life. In that reimagined future, we will measure economic growth by looking at our shared prosperity. These are bold ideas, and the depth of the systemic change we need can seem intimidating. But glimmers of that reimagined future are already showing up in the here and now. You've seen some of them today. It is our shared responsibility to reflect those glimmers more broadly. We need to spread these inclusive mindsets and these inclusive actions. And we need to be sure that the systemic change they represent becomes the foundation of our next normal. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. I appreciate your joining to share your reflections on the breakouts that preceded your remarks and your thoughts on the future and the fundamental need for our industry to just be different when it comes to inclusion and integration. I'm pleased to say that you'll be staying for the next session. It's great to have you here as well. I did see during your remarks a lot of comments in the chat box about the breakout sessions. And thank you everyone for your interest in them. They were all recorded, and those recording links will be shared with all attendees after the event. So if you missed one or weren't able to get to all the ones you were interested in, not to worry, they'll be shared with you. So I'm really pleased to say that Amit is going to be staying with us for the next session, and he'll be joined by a visionary in the field of inclusive economics, and the discussion is going to focus on sharing a perspective that we don't get to hear very often. And so I'm really thrilled for that. So Amit, if you'll join me here again, and also I'll welcome your guest, Carol Ann Hilton.
Thank you, Sapna. I'm so excited to have Carol Ann joining us today. And if you heard episode 5 of our podcast, The Next Normal, you will know exactly why. As the founder and CEO of the Indigenomics Institute, she is one of the leading global voices pressing for economic inclusion of Indigenous communities. Carol Ann, welcome to Next Normal Now.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely thrilled to have you. And I thought it would be good for us to start with the basics. Your work is fundamentally about including the traditionally excluded, Indigenous peoples. Your term indigenomics may still be new for many in our audience, and I was hoping you could explain a little bit about what do you mean by the term?
Absolutely. Thank you. So I developed the concept of indigenomics originally on social media, and it was a way to depict this media narrative of the growing strength of stories of Indigenous business successes and challenges nationally and globally. The concept has emerged to really define economics from an Indigenous worldview.
Mhm.
And I have built the concept around the process of modern Indigenous constructive generative economic design. And it's re-including Indigenous worldview into mainstream economics that has devalued and excluded other perspectives of what economics is and can be.
No, well, thank you for sharing that. And I think this point about kind of devaluing and excluding is something that's so core with what we need to reckon with today. Can you talk a little bit about the economic exclusion experience of Indigenous people all around the world and how that might relate to or mirror the exclusion of other minority groups globally?
For sure. So I come from the Heshquit people on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, and we experienced some of the first contact of boats coming into our territory and established trade relationships. And at the time, the volatility of the relationship required for the establishment of a country to serve the economic displacement of Indigenous people. What occurred was the devaluing of Indigenous economic knowledge systems. So, in order to be able to access resources, transportation, and systems for the regulations and structures of the evolution of nationality, what had to occur was that economic displacement, economic isolation. And it's really within a short amount of time that Indigenous economic empowerment has been on the rise. And when the ability of Indigenous peoples to facilitate inherent sense of responsibility, identity, and place, the ability to understand that economic distortion is really about the invisibility of other stories within economy. So, introducing this concept of economic distortion, what becomes important in that is to be able to really look at economic impact, economic regression, and this concept of the rise of economic empowerment of Indigenous peoples and other groups in a more specific way.
No, thank you. And one of the things that struck me that you said before is, and I'll quote you here, is that that the world is converging on, and quote, an economic identity crisis of its own making, and that the inclusion and revaluing of Indigenous worldview can be part of the solution. How can the Indigenous worldview inform the design of a more inclusive economic system, and what would that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. As the world begins to convene around this idea of the potential of net zero economy, of a low carbon transition, to be able to understand of emerging from the industrial age, the thinking and structures of productivity, development, progress have all been slanted from one worldview. To be able to include other worldviews is also an essential component of where solutions will arise from. To be able to understand that the world is recovering from the mentality of industrialization, the hundreds of years of process is such a short sliver of time in reality from Indigenous worldview. So to be able to re-include or revalue Indigenous knowledge systems around place, identity, responsibility. My work in indigenomics is positioning the concept of indigenous futurisms, that oftentimes we inherently look at indigenous peoples in past context. But the concept of indigenous futurisms is really that our knowledge systems, our ways of being, our ways of living within the earth, our concepts of responsibility are based around this idea of 7 generations. So, how do we make decisions today that reflect the responsibility of 7 generations in the future? We don't have an economy that looks at the long term impacts of decision making today. And inherent within Indigenous worldview is a deeper sense of impact, a longer sense of time, and a deeper sense of responsibility to ourselves and to our own future and to our future grandchildren. This idea of Indigenous futurism, I believe, is essential to the human response of what we're converging on, of the biggest questions of our time. That question of our time looks at how are we responsible to the results that we're creating. And we can look at those results in numerous ways, of whether that's temperature, carbon, those aspects. So responsibility of results, we recall that in my language, um, the concept of essentially everything is one and interconnected.
Mhm.
So this concept of sawak, the interrelationship, the oneness of reality, that idea in itself expresses relationship. So people often ask me, what is indigenomics? And I refer to it as relational economy. So how do we strengthen our relationship to each other, to our results, to life forms or life itself? So looking at resources rather than value creation, but shifting towards responsibility. So
Mhm.
some of those aspects are very transferable within what the big questions of our lifetime are as humanity itself, as we grapple with climate change and those aspects of globalization.
When I want to pick up on that point, you often describe the powerful relationship that many indigenous people have with the planet. Can you tell us a little bit more about that relationship and how it influences the environmental thinking of a new, more inclusive economy?
Yeah, for sure. I like this idea of this power moment where Indigenous peoples are expressing new structures and new thinking into nationality and economy. I like this idea in Bolivia of as a primarily Indigenous driven population country, that the rights of Mother Earth are embedded within the Constitution. What
Mhm.
has essentially caused or the outcome of that is that international mining companies have to shift the way that they relate both to the people, to the country, and to that resource. So, as a fundamental shift, understanding Indigenous worldview and its incorporation into process, into an industry or sector, and the required response. I like to, in having just written my book, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, that's very much an example of Indigenous peoples taking a seat at the economic table, taking control of an Indigenous economic agenda in a new way that ensures higher degrees of responsibility, less externalized international um, agendas, and an increased ability to facilitate responsibility. Those are some of the key aspects that I think at an international level we're seeing. And again, examples like the Maori people in New Zealand who have established the legal structure of the right of the river as a living
Mhm.
entity. So it's such a significant shift, whereas from an extractive, industrialized process as we would experience within economy as we know it, the significant shift from an indigenous worldview in itself facilitates responsibility, impact, and results and long-termism in new and innovative ways.
No, that's it's so powerful, and I think it's such an inspiring vision. Can you talk a little bit about how we take action toward the more inclusive vision you're describing? What are some of the things that you're calling for in your work?
Yeah, for sure. So in my work, I describe this power moment, and essentially that being able to look around us and understand where it is that we're seeing what is being built from a singular worldview. When we understand this moment that's happening across North America of the uprising of people of otherness other than white, to realize the systems of exclusion, the systems and regulatory and structures um, of colonialism itself. This is essentially a reckoning of our ability to look at our own leadership of who is being excluded within this conversation, and how would this immediate conversation in front of us shift with other perspectives included. And it's happening in a very raw level in terms of
Mhm.
uprising, and it's also happening at a very organic level of internal leadership, of building our response to our leadership in our conversations, leadership and discipline in what it is that we're seeing, and leadership in our conversations. And it's in that leadership, in across that spectrum of leadership, that I believe that the facilitation of new results is going to be happening, of other perspectives, new ways of being, new structures, new systems of design and investment. And it, in that in itself, the ability to facilitate positive results.
I completely agree that I do think this is such a challenging time because there is such a reckoning with so many of the issues that have existed for such a long time. I'm also I share your hope that this will result in some significant change and some real results that bring us together and really reinforce those themes of interconnectedness and interdependence that you spoke about. As we bring this to a close, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is actually that point about a reckoning with our past and with our reality of what we're dealing with today. One of the things that makes your perspective so powerful is the way you connect modern economic thinking with traditional indigenous wisdom. And ever since we recorded our podcast episode, I've been reflecting on one story in particular, the tale of the Thunderbird. Would you please share that again?
For sure. So, in Indigenous reality, the interrelationship between the physical domain of what we see immediately in front of us and the spiritual domain of what we don't know about other world is the supernatural and the expression of that. So, in my Indigenous culture, and you'll see that across many Indigenous cultures, the representation of the supernatural. So we have a bird that lives in the other domain, that lives within the spiritual domain, and it's called a thunderbird. And the concept of the thunderbird in itself is a power domain that disrupts reality. In our tradition, the thunderbird throws down lightning and feeds on a whale. And the lightning is the interplay between the spiritual and the physical domain. In that lightning at the end, what it picks up the whale is a double-headed sea serpent. And in the representation of that double-headed sea serpent, it is described as the most gruesome and the most fearsome creature that you can ever come across. And it's gigantic and wreathing, and that if you were to ever come across this double-headed sea serpent, that essentially you have that choice that upon coming across it, you can look at it and see its double wreathing head looking at you. And in that choice, you can run away. But in that choice, if you run away, you'll run away forever. And if you choose to stay and face the double headed sea serpent, what occurs is that its double wreathing head turns into itself, and it collapses into itself, and you stand in your truth forever. And I use that metaphor and representation of the choice that we have as humanity right now. We can address the choices that has gotten us here to this temperature point. We can address the choice and choose to run away in fear, or we can address what is in front of us and choose to stand in our truth. And that representation is what new truth is it that we're building. And to be able to take responsibility for those results, the Indigenous worldview of long-termism, of responsibility, and taking collective choice of what our results are, I very much believe strongly that humanity is at a tipping point where we can choose to be able to stand in fear and run, or we can make new choices, new structures, new systems of design and systems of inclusion, and address the places of exclusion that have also caused where we are at today.
Thank you. And I think that, that choice and standing in that truth, I think is something that really has stuck with me. And I do think this is a time of choice. And there are different paths that we can take, but I certainly think this is the moment for us to think about, like, how do we build a better system, a more inclusive system, and a system that works for everyone. I really appreciate the way that story connects the themes of both courage and urgency. And if we're going to build the more inclusive economic system we're talking about here today, we absolutely need to be courageous in our thinking and courageous in our action. The only time to take big action that our world needs is right now. And Carol Ann, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Amit and Carol Ann. That was certainly quite inspiring. I hadn't quite heard that perspective ever before, and I think, like me, I see many in the chat were inspired and found powerful stories that resonated in Carol Ann's message. I really liked the sort of thinking on interrelationships and focusing on relationships as opposed to entities, and thinking about the oneness of reality, I think it was, and the relationships between people and the relationships between people and natural resources. And also, I think the relationship across time. So not just thinking about the past, but thinking about the past as connected to our actions and our choices now as connected to the future. And that's really powerful. I think it takes the emphasis off of a transaction and embeds a lot more meaning in the work. So if anyone wants to dig into that conversation a little bit more and hear the tale of a Thunderbird again, or continue with Amit and Carol Ann's conversation, you can do so on the episode of Amit's podcast, Next Normal, recorded late last year with Carol Ann Hilton. It's now time for our final session, which is a storytelling panel where we can hear really powerful, practical, and impactful stories of actors working for the push for inclusion from the perspective of financial inclusion. So I will, to turn it over to that session, introduce my colleague, the GIIN's Manager of Communications, George Spencer, to join us here. And he'll welcome his guests as well. And I just want to remind everyone before I formally hand off to George that if you would like your chat to be visible to everybody, please do select all panelists and attendees from the drop-down menu, and that'll make sure it's visible to everyone. So thank you very much, and welcome, George.
Thank you, Sapna, very much. And big hello to all of our attendees who are joining us from around the world. Again, my name is George Spencer, and I am Manager of Communications here at the Global Impact Investing Network. And I am delighted to welcome you to this session, Impact Investing in Action, Stories from the Field. We just heard a storytelling session of sorts with Carol Ann Hilton and Amit, and we're going to continue that theme right now. We certainly hope that you are inspired by today's visions of a more inclusive next normal for our global economic system, but we also want to make that future concrete and understandable. At the GIIN, we really see impact investing as a tangible illustration of the path forward, really an illustration of finance's potential as a force for good in tackling the world's most pressing social and environmental problems. Many impact investors would say that impact investing done well is a combination of heart and head, of art and science. So this session will actually walk through two real-world examples of finance used in that transformed way from the perspective of the impact investors who actually made it happen, and highlighting the perspectives of their investees and the end consumers. Both of our examples today happen to come from Southeast Asia, and both are generally focused on financial inclusion impact. So it really offers a perfect window into what has changed in that region and what has not changed. So without further ado, I am really delighted to welcome to our virtual stage Shuyin Tang, a partner at Palomar Capital, who will be talking about the firm's relatively recent investment in the GIIN Group, which is like Shuyin, based in Vietnam. And our second panelist today is Jaco Menar of Triodos Investment Management. Jaco will be speaking about a much longer running investment that his firm has made in Akleda Bank, which is based in Cambodia. So Shuyin and Jaco, welcome to the Next Normal Now stage. We're delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good to have you both here. And just to orient for the audience how we're going to proceed through this, we're using probably the simplest storytelling structure of all, a question of how did it begin? What happened next, and where do things stand today? And if we're going to be getting into this question of how things began, there's probably no better way to do that than on the personal front. And Shuyin, we're going to begin with you, and I'd like to hear a little bit about how you ended up on the impact investing path. Tell us a bit about your backstory.
Thanks so much, George. It's a real privilege to be here today. And I get asked this question quite a bit, and many people look at my career and they assume that I planned it out in great detail with a lot of forethought. But actually, I think it's more a lesson of, you don't know where life is going to take you. So when I graduated, I really wanted to join the UN or the Foreign Service. Those were my big dreams. And I was barely aware of venture capital or private equity, let alone impact investing. And because my plan A of working for the UN or the Foreign Service didn't work out, I actually ended up taking a job at Bain & Company, the management consulting firm. And wasn't my plan at the time, but really grateful that I did that. I mean, I learned so much, I met great people, and importantly, also had the opportunity to take a transfer to Bain's India office. And it was that experience which really got me excited about emerging markets in a meaningful way. And it was actually also in India that I first heard about impact investing. And I was very intrigued. So this idea that you could invest in companies and both make a financial return as well as a social or environmental return, very compelling idea. I think, fast forward a decade, I learned there's a lot more complexity behind that simple concept and idea. How do you measure impact? What's the trade-off between, is there a trade-off between impact and financial return, et cetera, et cetera. But, I think at its core, it's still that kind of basic, simple idea that really resonates with me to this day, and really glad to have dedicated most of my career to impact investing.
Yeah, we can, Shuyin, hear that sort of personal spark in your voice, even as you recount that story. You're going to be talking to us about this particular investment in the GIIN Group, which is like you, is based in Vietnam. Want to hear, of course, at least a sentence or two about what exactly they do, but more about what sparked your interest in investing in this particular company. What captured your sort of personal enthusiasm, your investing enthusiasm?
Absolutely. So I've been in Vietnam for about 8 years, as you mentioned, and since I've come here, I've really been on the lookout for an SME lending company, right? So I think financial inclusion is a focus area for us at Palomar Capital, and I think the SME segment is a particular segment that we're very excited about. And I think it's because of that long-term search that I can remember the first meeting that I had with Tao, the founder and CEO of GIIN, kind of like it was yesterday. I mean, I know that's a bit of a cliche, but it really, I can picture it very clearly in my mind. I don't know how to say it. I mean, another way to say it, but I think she's a real boss. She understands her customer so well. And just to maybe say a little bit more about the business to give people context, right? So the main customer segment of GIIN are micro SMEs. So they're small stores with a physical location. So that could be a small food outlet, like a noodle stand, a vegetable seller in a market, or a mum and pop store. And I think when we sat down, one of the first things that Tao said was, there's two things that you have to know about this segment. So number one is that it's really quite impossible to separate the business from the personal for these business owners, right? And it's interesting. I mean, that's not something we always want to hear as an impact investor, I have to admit. And we typically like to know, how these funds might be used. Will they be used for productive purposes, et cetera, et cetera. But I can understand, also knowing this segment myself, that's not the reality, right, of these types of companies and micro SMEs. The second thing that she said was perhaps even more interesting and intriguing. And that was that these customers, they may not take out a loan because they need the money. And I was like, what, really? Like, what do you mean that they don't need the money and they're taking out a loan? And the interesting thing there is that they might not need the money today, but they really want to build in this optionality, right, of being able to take out a loan in the future. So to know that there's this cushion and that they have the ability to plan ahead. And as there isn't any other source of formal financing for these micro businesses, GIIN is actually one of the only ways, maybe the only way in Vietnam at least, that they can build up that financial discipline and credit history so that they're able to take out a loan in the future when there is a specific need. And I think what really struck me during that first meeting was that you don't have these insights unless you're really closely connected to the customer and living and breathing this segment every day. And I think that's what really impressed me and drew me to the business and my team as well on that day, and I think pretty much ever since. I do remember walking out of that meeting, which was only, I think, an hour long, and turning to my colleague and saying like, wow, I think this really could be something. And sometime later, we actually ended up making the investment.
Very, very interesting, Xuyen. And I know from the moment we began discussing this topic, you knew that this was the investment that you wanted to talk to us about, because you were so struck, even from the very beginning, by that meeting with the CEO. And as you said, her knowledge of the customer. So Jaco, it's now your turn, and I'm going to make you start with that same personal backstory that we just heard from Xuyen, and ask you a little bit about how you arrived years ago on this impact investing path.
Yeah, thank you, George. Yeah, when I grew up, we're talking now sort of 80s, then on the television I would learn about emerging markets. But what I would learn was that there are basically people that need help, that need donations, that may suffer from hunger. Ethiopia. And when I started to travel, then I found a totally different emerging markets, because I found extremely entrepreneurial people, people who were 99.9% just like me, but environments with many more barriers. So that intrigued me immediately. And then during my studies, I did an internship in Indonesia with Unilever. So I got to know emerging markets a bit more. And I knew then, if ever I have a chance to contribute and work in emerging markets, I will. And that chance actually appeared in the year 2000. I was living together with my now wife, and we were then friends. And she got the opportunity to have a job with the United Nations in Cambodia. So I followed her to Cambodia and ended up living and working with the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, for the next 6 years. And I think it's fair to say that period changed my life.
Jaco, it's interesting, the personal backstory there that you just recounted, following your wife to Cambodia, because I know that is laying the groundwork for the investment story that you're gonna tell us today. Acleda Bank, this has been a Triodos investment, long running, but obviously one when you were less in your management capacity and more out there directly working in the fields that you were involved in from the very start. So in the same way that I asked Xuyen, what was it about this Acleda Bank in those early days that sparked your interest and your investing enthusiasm?
Well, you know, the story of Cambodia and of Akleda is quite special. I mean, as many people might know, Cambodia suffered under the Khmer Rouge. We're now talking 70s. But many people still lived in the refugee camps for a long period after. It was only in 98 when really the civil war officially stopped. And Akleda was actually started in those same refugee camps. It was started by a teacher, now their long-term CEO in Chani. And so when I talked to In Chani, that was a very special impression. I mean, he's very modest. He's almost humble. But in the meantime, he has built a bank from an NGO into a specialized bank, now a full-blown bank that services almost all sectors of society, still with a focus on ordinary Cambodians.
Jaco, because I know that Akleda has grown into this big bank, that's the later part of the story. But in those early days, could you see that focus on sort of ordinary folk? Is that really what you point to as drawing your investment enthusiasm to this particular investment possibility?
Yeah, I think what made them special is that it was clear that they had a very strong social mission. It was not maybe that finance was second, but they were equal. It was also clear that their mission, in a time when everybody was talking about microcredit, or microcredit was actually starting its way up, they were already thinking much broader. Financial services is not just about credit. It's also about savings. It's also about payments. And I was traveling the countryside, you know, and I would be sitting in this shared taxi, and people would give envelopes because that was the only way you could actually transfer money in the country. I mean, in a physical envelope with a taxi driver that you barely knew, and then just hope that it would arrive. And that vision that you needed a broader service offering, that was already there. So that was the one thing. And the other thing is that Cambodia is quite a corrupt country, and especially on the government side. But Akleda was from day one an organization that was really built on merit and on very high ethical standards. And In Chani was day in, day out, basically enforcing that. So he once told me a story that no matter who it was in the company, if it was a cleaning lady that would, you know, steal a bar of soap, that was a no-go for him. You know, we don't do that in this company. We do it differently. And it made them very attractive to young graduates, you know, because mostly it was who you knew that would, you know, define your opportunities. But with Akleda, it was actually what you can do.
I'm struck by both of you how these founders or these leaders of the companies that you ended up investing in, both of them in their own ways, spoke to you each in your own way in those early days. I want to move on to sort of the second stage of this discussion in our storytelling, is this question of, okay, so the initial connection happened. What happened next? How did the investment unfold? And for that, GIIN, I'm going to go back to you, and I'd like to hear you talk about your Kim An Group investment, which I know is, if I'm correct, only about a year old. When you think about the big picture of what's going on in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, what is it about this investment that made it innovative and forward-looking?
Sure. So I think it's, as you correctly pointed out, I mean, we're still quite early on, you know, in our journey with Kim An. It's a bit different from Jaco's situation with Akleda. But, you know, as you said, I mean, we made our investment in Q2 of last year, right? So, and what was happening in Q2 of last year? It was, you know, wall-to-wall coverage of the pandemic, obviously, right? And I think the fact that we made our investment into, you know, a lending platform at that time, where probably most people were not investing at all, right? Or at least, I mean, rethinking some of their strategies, I mean, really speaks to the level of conviction that we had in Tao, her team, and the work that they are doing, right? And you know, I think there's certainly been a lot of learning over the past year about how to operate a lending platform during this time of great uncertainty. But you know, I think overall the company has certainly emerged stronger, right? Last year, I think this is really interesting. It actually grew its loan book, right? Which I think is a testament both to the company itself, and I think the way that it managed through a crisis. But I think I also have to say, due to the I think amazing response of Vietnam, right? I'm not sure whether people on this call have been aware, but I mean, Vietnam has, basically we live our life as normal, right? Despite not having the vaccine yet, because the government and I think the people as well, society, have done such a great job in really managing the pandemic. You also asked the question of, what do we see when we look ahead? And I mean, the market for micro SME lending or SME lending in Vietnam is so huge, right? There are 5 million such companies in Vietnam, 98% of all businesses. So I think the only question or the only challenge for a company like GIIN is really how fast can it scale up to really meet that demand, right? And while at the same time relentlessly managing risk, which is for sure one of the big things to master, right? In the kind of lending business. So I think that's I think it's the ability to do both of those things, right? I think grow during a very difficult situation, and I think we see very exciting signs now as we come out of the pandemic, but then also really keep risk under control. That made the company stand out to us. And of course, I mean, back to the people again, the amazing management team.
And sticking with that theme of people, Shuyan, because I know you have been close. Obviously, it's been a year, and it's been a bumpy year, no matter where we are in the world. But there was a famous bike ride. I mean, you have actually been out with the team as they did their daily collections. Tell me a bit about that, and talk to me about the end consumer, the end client that is actually being served by GIIN.
Yeah, I mean, I think one part of the GIIN model, which is I think mind-blowing in some ways, is they actually do these daily collections for some of their products. And as you say, that literally means there's a collector who drives around his or her neighborhood and collects from the customers, right, from stall to stall to stall. And I think that recognizes the simple fact that most of these business owners are busy running their business, right, and don't have time to like visit a branch or like go to the bank or et cetera, et cetera. And mobile money penetration is still relatively low in Vietnam. So I think it's an amazing feature of the business. But I think one, in terms of the end customer, I think there's a story that that the CEO told me, which really stood out, I think, for me. And it's about a lady named Nhung, and she's one of GIIN's customers. And back in 2017, she was looking for a loan. So she's, again, very typical case. I mean, she's a food stall owner looking for a small loan for her son's tuition fees, right? Not many options available. There's very little formal financing for the segment anyway. She doesn't have much collateral. And she actually wants a short-term loan, right? Which matches with her business cash flow. This is not like a long-term, investment into CapEx or something like that, right? She wants something just for a couple of months to meet this immediate need. So she took out a loan back in 2017. The GIIN team got to know her very well, seeing her every day, right? Collecting at her store. And now, fast forward, I think, basically almost 4 years, right? She's actually taken out 15 loans with GIIN. So she's been a really regular repeat customer. Wow. I know that might sound like some crazy outlier, but actually most of, or the average number of loans that a GIIN customer takes out is 5, right? So I think the fact that they keep on coming back, and I think the way that I think it illustrates the point that they're using this as kind of a cash cushion, right? A way to kind of plan their financial needs, manage their financial needs over time in a really interesting way that is quite special to these micro business owners. So I think that is, and I know time is short, that is one emblematic story, I think, of GIIN's borrowers.
Shuyan, it's powerful. And when we think about customers repeating 5 times up to 15 times, as in the case of that specific woman you mentioned, it speaks to the growth of this investment, of course, but also to the impact that you all are intending. Jaco, it's your turn again. I'm going to switch over to you. And so, Akleda, you've set the stage for us of this this investee, the leader there of Akleda, who spoke to you in those early days and who gave you the conviction that this would be a smart investment. We want to know now how it unfolded. What was innovative about the work that Akleda was doing as this process has unfolded that has really made it stand out for you?
Yeah, so I arrived originally in Cambodia in the year 2000. And back then, the largest branch network of any bank was 5 branches. So most banks, there were about 25 banks in the country, but 20 plus of them had 1 branch. in the capital city, Phnom Penh. That was it. So this was a country, of course, where money didn't exist after the Khmer Rouge for a long time, where trust was very low in the banking sector. And I think it's fair to say that Akleda did that not all by itself, but it was, I think, the one leading the way to actually bring financial inclusion to the country. So about 10 years after the year 2000, they had basically covered the whole country. So they had 330 branches, and they could be reached anywhere in the country. They did not only do loans, but also did all these other products that I just mentioned. And from then on, they started also to make things easier for people, including developing mobile money and things like that. And nowadays, we are wondering whether Cambodia starts to be overbanked in some parts of the country almost. So we're going all the way to the other end of the spectrum. And Akleda did this in its ethical way, like I said. So let me give you one more example. In a country like Cambodia, it was not so easy to pay your taxes. So the local tax, the IRS, would basically not just accept your payment, and so they would actually have to go all the way to the Minister of Finance to say, look, together with PwC, we have exactly calculated how much tax we have to pay, and we insist we pay the full amount. I mean, and in some cases, it meant that all of the other banks also had to start paying certain taxes that they didn't previously.
So Jaco, from underbanked to the possibility of actually being overbanked in Cambodia. Talk to us though about the ordinary people being impacted by this. Can you give us a portrait of what this change and this growth by Akleda has meant for sort of a regular end customer?
Yeah, and I have also made trips into the countryside, and in the year 2000, 2001, 2002, I mean, you have to imagine that if I traveled from Phnom Penh to Battambang, which is maybe second, third largest city in the country, 80 kilometers, that would took you 6 hours. I mean, the potholes were so big back then, or the bridges would be missing in the rainy season, in the monsoon season, that it was really difficult to get around the country. But obviously what Akleda has done, it has given people who sometimes had very difficult backgrounds. I remember meeting somebody who was orphaned at the age of 12, was very fortunate that he actually grew up in a good family afterwards, and then started a chicken farm, and with the money from Akleda was able to expand that. And we have many positive stories like that in Cambodia. At the same time, another example is that I actually lived in the province close to the Thai border for some time with my wife, and we had guards there to guard our house at night. And when we left, we decided to give them a grant to start their own business, and one of them was very successful actually at starting his own business. So when in 2006 we said goodbye to Cambodia, the first two guests to arrive at the party were actually Inchani, the CEO of Akleda, and my former guard, a guy from the province. And they started talking, and it was just great. And Inchani said, "So have you ever taken out a loan of Akleda?" And he said, "No, it's way too expensive. Why would I?"
Oops.
And that's another thing, because we've had also, of course, had our challenges in the sector. Is that pricing in the past was quite high, so scale and new technology has really helped to drive down these interest rates. A very important part to make it affordable for people. And nowadays, and this goes for the old sort of microfinance, but it also goes for the newer sort of tech, the fintech type of microfinance. I mean, we have to be really careful with over indebtedness, because some people in Cambodia might have taken out 3 or more loans and not have the capacity to repay.
Fascinating stuff, and the encounter of the guard at your house with the bank CEO, certainly one that we can understand why that would have been lodged in your memory in that way. Recognizing our time, I want to move us to sort of a bit of the next chapter, which is where things stand today with these two investments that you're both recounting for us today. And so as such, Shuyan, we're going to go back over to you, and I'd like to hear a bit about the impact here. And if you could just talk to us, Shuyin, a little bit, you guys are still very much in this investment. As you said, it's just more than a year old for Patamar. Tell us about the financial and the impact metrics you are watching for Kim-An Group.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as with many of our investments, the financial and impact metrics are often, intertwined, at least at some level, right? I mean, I think the way that we look at, the number of customers being served, right? I think the level of customer satisfaction, the number of times customers come back, right? The repeat customers. I mean, I think these are very important, I think, business operational metrics, but also very important impact metrics, right? To know whether we're ultimately meeting the needs of these customers and contributing to their financial resilience. So yeah, those are some of those things that we look at. Obviously, from a financial perspective, we're looking at revenue growth, and I think risk management as well. But but I think it does actually fit together as it does in so many of our different investments, both the financial and impact side.
So Shuyin, I want to ask you to do a little bit of laddering up to this theme of inclusive economic growth that we are talking about across this Next Normal Now session today. Here you have recounted in a very personal way your path to this impact investing work, which started in a more quote unquote traditional way and then brought you here. You've recounted that powerful first meeting with the founder and the CEO of Kim-An Group. You talked about then this end customer who went back, a repeat customer 15 different times to get the capital that she needed to make her very small business work. When you put this in context, how does it connect to these sort of visions of inclusivity that we're talking about today?
Right. I think what I really love about the Kim-An investment is that it really seeks to empower the little guy, right? I guess that's not very sophisticated language, but that's the way I think about it. And yeah, as I mentioned before, right? I mean, these are the businesses which account for 98% of businesses in Vietnam, yet they are really underserved, right? Not just when it comes to credit, I would say, but with a whole variety of different products and services. So I think, the fact that there are companies, right, who are really focused on understanding their needs, right, helping them stay competitive, I think in a rapidly changing landscape is very exciting. I think on the one hand, it's important to recognize that these businesses are still, very fragmented. They're very informal, they're low tech, right? So you have to meet them where they are. But at the same time, and I think Jaco, talked about this as well. I mean, we're really interested by the way that Kim-An seeks to use, I think, technology to, bring down the interest rate and also kind of make their business more efficient and accessible. And then secondly, provide a wider platform and suite of financial products, which really meets the segment needs, right? So I think they're starting with the segment where it is today, and then I think really helping them grow and evolve on their journey, which is, I think, the amazing contribution that Kim-An is making, and I think will hopefully make even more in this journey.
And absolutely, Shuyin, and with the level of growth that you are mentioning, even during this pandemic year, easy to see why Patamar is expecting that. So Jaco, back to you. This is your investment, Akleda. This has been long running for Triodos, and you've talked about sort of the depth of the relationships there. Bring it into the present for us. What are you watching in terms of this investment, financial metrics, impact metrics? What has it done in the country of Cambodia? You've touched on some of that, but put a bow on it for us. Yeah,
and we are watching some things that Shuyin already mentioned, then that I will not sort of just repeat. But I mean, I actually am a little bit jealous of Shuyin because she's really still making the investments today, and I'm nowadays in a slightly different position. But sometimes I wish I would be there, and I try to stay connected to the teams as much as I can. But I think to add to what Shuyin said is that we also look both at, of course, financial indicators and investees report on those, and they also report on their impact indicators. And in the past, very important things were we reaching, rural people? Were we reaching women? Those type of things. A second level that is more difficult to measure is what I talked about in terms of how Akleda has really helped to change the sector. And People in the chat are also talking about, how you change that business enabling environment. So I like to call that, what we try to do is we finance change, and that's the level of Acleda, but we also want to change finance. We also want to make the sector as a whole more inclusive. And so that second level is often a bit more qualitative. You cannot capture everything in numbers, but I find that very important as well.
So Jaco, I get to ask you the same question that I asked Shuyan about connecting up to this bigger vision of inclusive economic growth. You recounted your sort of personal story of following your wife's career, it sounds like largely to Cambodia, and then the encounter with the leader of Acleda, who would go on to manage this bank that has become the country's biggest, and then the people who have been impacted along the way. When you think about this long-running connection that Triodos has had with Acleda and where things stand today, how does it connect to our theme of inclusive economic growth?
Well, I think it actually connects on many different levels. I think first and foremost, it is the intentionality that we have as investors, but that also Acleda has, that through the activities, its core business, it wants to change the lives of people in a positive way. But it is also inclusive in terms of the staff that they hire. I mean, it's locally managed. It's majority locally owned. So it is really rooted in society to some extent. And I think that can be very important as well. And that also helps to have that really long-term focus that also was talked about in the previous session. And then finally, obviously, there's the inclusion at the customer level. So I already told you that the low level of banking in Cambodia before, and the opportunities that people now have to manage their lives and their businesses better through financial services. So I see those different levels of inclusivity.
Jaco and Shuyan, we are absolutely at time, and it is time for us to wrap up. But I think thematically, what you both have talked about, those different layers of inclusion, Jaco, that you just mentioned, has been sort of the story of what I heard in breakout rooms and what I have been hearing across our event today is infusing these notions of inclusion throughout the work that we do. So Jaco and Shuyan, we have to leave it there. At the GIIN, we often talk that impact investing is really sort of an illustration of the way that we can create a more inclusive and a more sustainable future. And I certainly think the two of you are examples of practitioners who are doing that. So thanks to you both so much for being with us today at Next Normal Now.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. And Shuyan.
Sapna, we'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, George. Thank you, Jaco and Shuyan. Incredible. And I think certainly a session that did exactly what George had told us it would do, which is connect the heart and the mind, or the art and the science, so to speak. So I really appreciate that. And one of the takeaways, what really struck me as you were speaking was the power of connection. Connection to either the markets you're trying to serve, connection to the customers to generate insights, and connection, I think, to yourselves and the meaning and drive behind why you do this work. So powerful. And for me, there was also an element of connection to you, for me, and I hope for this group, and connection to each other, because I think in a time where so many of us have spent so much time in the past year sitting in our own homes, working from our own couches, it's certainly inspiring to know that there are people out there whose work is aligned to the ambitions that we all have for a future that focuses on inclusive economic growth. And certainly this emphasis on empathy and connection, I think, is at the heart of what can drive inclusion. And certainly what Carol Ann Hilton was speaking to, which is the power of inclusion of another worldview. So I love the way that these stories bring to life what we're trying to do. And I hope that sends everyone off and back into their reality day jobs with a powerful message to kind of energize you through the remainder of your day, your week, your year. That concludes our first event for the Next Normal Now series. And I certainly want to thank every single one of the speakers that have joined us here, taken time out of their days to share their perspectives. Also want to thank each and every single one of you for joining and carving out time from your agendas to listen and learn and be part of this space together. And I do also want to thank our sponsors again for making this event possible. So thank you to Chemonics, Jonathan Rose Companies, Responsibility, KPMG, at Treehouse Investments, and Wellington Management. And also thanks to Impact Alpha, our marketing and media partner for today. So I do hope that all of you will join us for the next event in this series, which is June 16th, focused on an equally important topic, focused on climate action. So again, that's June 16th, focus on climate action. I hope to see you all here. In the meantime, do stay connected with us, and there's a few different ways that you can do that. If you have not already, sign up for our newsletter on our website. Follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn. You can also subscribe to Amit's podcast, Next Normal, and you can sign up for our membership as well, which offers you opportunities to sort of dive in more deeply and connect with other members in very practical and solution-oriented settings. So until June 16th, take care, stay safe, everyone, and thanks again to all who joined us here today.